The personal resonance of the Komagata Maru for me has been quite difficult. I've always wrestled with the Komagata Maru. In school, we're taught the Komagata Maru story. And so for me, in my early days, I sort of veered away from the Komagata Maru because I felt it was this one story that had this sort of hegemonic hold on South Asian Canadian history in BC. And there were other stories that need to be told. And as I went to university to try to find other stories, I came to terms with the Komagata Maru as being a story that was important in its own right, but that could coexist with other equally important stories. I would say there are probably two root causes of racism in British Columbia. The first root cause is understanding that the racism in BC goes back a very long time. Vancouver in particular has a long history of racism that has to come to terms with. In a sense, it's always this ongoing struggle, it's always this ongoing battle of education, of communication, of learning about the histories of cooperation and disseminating that so there are these alternate narratives to when a knee-jerk reaction of racism exists, we can pull upon something else and say, no, there are other histories out there that can be told. The Komagata Maru landed on May 23rd, 1914, 99 years ago, and it landed and stayed in Burrard Inlet. It had 376 passengers on board, the majority of whom were of the Sikh faith. The Komagata Maru stayed in the harbor for 2 months for a variety of reasons. The major one was racism. As citizens of the larger empire, of the British Empire, the Komagata Maru passengers should have had access to come to Canada. However, Canada had a continuous regulation, continuous journey regulation, and that meant that people had to come from their country of origin in order to come to Canada. And because no continuous line from India to Canada existed at that time period, it was this subtle way of excluding Indians from coming to Canada. Now, it came to the harbor in Burrard Inlet, and it created commotion. There are some amazing pictures of the first day when the Komagata Maru arrived, because papers like The Sun and The Province at the time were covering their arrival and saying that this boat is coming, the ship will be arriving. And at the day it arrived, there was this huge, great crowd at the harbor to see the boat, and everyone was quite excited. So the Komagata Maru stayed there for 2 months, and slowly over that time period, rations started running low. They ran low on food and on fresh water. Whether it was exclusionary policies by the mayor, the premier, the prime minister at that time, not wanting the Komagata Maru to land, and that challenge to go through the courts. But the challenge did eventually go through the courts, and what happened was the Komagata Maru was judged to have broken the law, and it was sent back to India. The legacy of the Komagata Maru in terms of treating other passengers who've come by boat, perhaps illegally, I think there are some resonance here that we can learn from. One in particular is that when people come by boat, or when these so-called illegal immigrants do come to Canada, the Tamil example is perhaps the most recent in terms of migrants who come from Sri Lanka leaving the civil war that was taking place there. And I feel that some of them were treated quite unjustly in terms of their treatment and being put in detention camps here close to British Columbia. Their story, I think, resonates not so much in terms of the exclusion of the Komagata Maru, but in terms of the racism, in terms of the hyper-surveillance of the world today, in terms of those elements that weren't around during Komagata Maru time, but still some of those same assumptions that are made about communities around the world when they come to Canada, and the automatic assumption of racism that still needs to be dealt with. Issues of racism, I think, haven't been too strong for me. When I look back at these stories told by the pioneer communities, racism was very overt. You can't have this job, you can't go to this school, you can't buy a home here, you can't vote. A lot of those restrictions were quite overt. The racism now is a bit more subtle, and it infiltrates its way in different discourses, whether it's discourses around gang violence or crime or other things along those lines. There's a difference between having an ethnic enclave and having a neighborhood, for instance. Those are subtle differences that perhaps are lost in terms of racism and the discourses of the community.